to EOCP 2021, our virtual operators conference. We are here in the leadership stream for the last presentation of the day. My name is Ben Konashenko and I'm your moderator. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome a couple of ladies from Metro Vancouver. First off, Maggie Boak is the Division Manager of Talent Management and Organizational Development with Metro Vancouver in the Human Resources Department. She's been there for 14 years. She holds a bachelor's degree from Dalhousie University, a postgrad diploma from Capilano University, and an HR management certificate from BCIT. In addition, Maggie is a chartered professional accountant in human resources. Also here today, we have Carolyn Shears. She's the lead HR advisor for organizational development with Metro Vancouver's Human Resources Department. She's been with Metro for 7 years, and she has a bachelor's degree in human resource management from Kwantlen Polytechnic University, an associate's certificate in leadership and conflict resolution from the JIBC, and she is also a chartered professional in the human resources area. So just to remind everybody, you can put your questions in the chat, and we'll circle back at the end. Maggie and Carolyn, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much for the warm welcome this afternoon. It is our honor and pleasure to participate as presenters today at EOCP's 2021 virtual conference. And the focus of our presentation today, diversity and inclusion at Metro Vancouver. It's an area of work Carolyn and I have spent a lot of time working in over the last year. It's an area that we're both passionate about, and it's currently in an area of work that our organization has invested fairly heavily in formalizing our work within this area. Currently, our focus is considering how we are incorporating the values, the tenets of diversity and inclusion in our talent acquisition streams of work, in our talent development streams of work, considering our workplace environment. And we're really excited to tell you a little bit about this journey and tell you about the ways in which we hope to be formalizing this work in a meaningful way at Metro Vancouver. So just a few words of welcome. Each of us presenting today, so Carolyn and I, we have different motivations, we have different experiences, we walk in different shoes. And for those of you participating, the same goes. Recognizing this and engaging in open dialogue corporately was a key motivator for formalizing our actions related to diversity and inclusion, and we'd encourage that same openness today. So when sort of launching this work within Metro Vancouver in a formal way, we recognized that it was a really big opportunity to bring our experience and our ideas forward and unite under a common goal to create a better place to work, a better place to learn, and really, make Metro Vancouver an organization that's more accessible to join, and where employees have that opportunity to bring their whole selves to work. And so with the support of our executive team to invest in these efforts, and, our employees have been empowered to form a team and to make recommendations for action and for change. So just before sort of moving into our agenda today, I'd just like to acknowledge that this isn't work that we've done formally before. We've conducted research, we've liaised with other organizations to consider best practices, but we also are learning as we go, and we'll be learning with you today as well from your questions and hopefully from sort of, any engagement we have today as well as subsequent to the session. So our agenda is fairly straightforward. There's three sort of main items that we'll be touching on. We'll talk briefly about Metro Vancouver. So who are we? What do we do as an organization? Many of you know this already, so we won't spend too much time there. Next, we'll sort of take you through the sort of key steps in our journey to date relating to diversity and inclusion at Metro Vancouver. And then we'll tell you a little bit about what we anticipate coming next. So who is Metro Vancouver and what do we do as an organization? As many of you are aware, Metro Vancouver, we provide regional-wide services to the region. We serve a population of 2.7 million people. We're a federation of 21 municipalities, an electoral area, and a treaty First Nation. And we collaboratively plan and deliver regional-scale services. So our core services would be water, wastewater treatment, solid waste management, but we also manage a regional parks system, regulate air quality, plan for urban growth, and provide affordable housing to communities throughout the Lower Mainland. We are governed by a board of directors of elected officials from each local authority. We have our organization is made up of 4 legal entities. Really briefly, the Metro Vancouver Regional District, the Sewer and Drainage District, the Greater Vancouver Water District, and the Metro Vancouver Housing Corporation. And the history of each, they weren't all established all at once, and they date from 1914 with the Sewerage and Drainage District all the way to 1974 with the formation of the Metro Vancouver Housing Corporation. We're a reasonably large employer. We have about 1,800 employees with 3 employee groups, 2 of which are unions, and then our exempt and management group. And more than half of our employees are employed in the water and wastewater sector. Also notably and importantly in terms of our attendance and participation in this conference today, a considerable number of our staff are EOCP certified, and these staff operate, maintain a vast network of water and wastewater infrastructure, consisting of 5 wastewater treatment plants, 3 water treatment plants, a region-wide network of water transmission and wastewater collection pipes, pump stations, dams, and various other pieces of infrastructure required to deliver water to the region as well as collect and treat wastewater. So as we mentioned in our agenda, the focus of this presentation, it's not about the infrastructure or the work that we do, but about the people we employ, their workplace experience, and the journey that we've embarked on as an organization to be intentional about our focus on diversity and inclusion. And in terms of this journey to date, there's been a number of key actions and milestones. And so we'll take you through those sort of step by step. And just at a high, to provide you an overview of what those steps are. The first one was the proposal for this work and a bit of background information as to sort of what led us to formalize our approach to diversity and inclusion at Metro Vancouver. The next is, and so that background and proposal, that's in and around June 2020. In December 2020, we launched an employee experience and diversity survey in partnership with BC Stats. And then we formed a project team in and around, we initiated that work in and around February of this year. And more recently, so in the spring and summer of 2021, we've been developing a strategic plan and establishing common language in and around diversity and inclusion. And so we'll provide, in the rest of this presentation, we'll provide some context in terms of each of those steps, as well as sort of look forward a little bit in terms of what we foresee coming next. So in terms of the background, as I mentioned, it was about 2 years ago now that as an organization, the realization was made that we weren't doing enough relating to diversity and inclusion. There was a gap. Up until that point in time, our approach was mindful to incorporate the principles of diversity and inclusion into what we did, so into our recruitment processes, into our practices, into our professional development opportunities, but we didn't have a standalone program. We didn't have resources specifically allocated to this work. And we came to this realization that, not sort of having a concerted effort, a focused program was a gap, and we weren't doing enough. And in terms of why we came to that realization when we did, I would say that there wasn't one thing. There would be a few drivers for that. World events being one, certainly. The inequities and challenges that have surfaced relating to the current pandemic being another. And so we recognized that we needed an organized, concerted program and the opportunity for employees from all parts of the organization to participate. And so with that, the work that we're about to sort of talk about was initiated. As part of this work, it was, we needed to consider what diversity means to us and why inclusion was important. And as well, we needed to sort of consider how at a high level were we going to approach this work. So from the research we conducted, we also, we recognize the importance that when talking about diversity, we weren't talking about just the common visible differences such as gender, ethnicity. Other less visible, invisible differences were just as important. So these things could include things such as life experiences, sexual orientation, background, language, belief systems, working style preferences, culture, lifestyles, all of those things, in addition to the, important and critical visible differences that make up sort of diversity, that make up our employee population, all those less visible, invisible, and visible differences, we were talking about all of them when we were in terms of our approach to diversity. So, thinking about this, the way I look may provide you with some information, but there's layers to that. And experiences, family connections, family makeup, values, beliefs that aren't visible to you by looking at me. Those things that we can't see are important to recognize. And it's also, it's critical to sort of note that our perceptions, our biases, unconscious or not, our assumptions are something we need to keep in mind as well. At a high level, in terms of inclusion, how are we approaching inclusion? What are we talking about relating to inclusion? At a high level, we're talking about cultivating a sense of belonging and cultivating an environment that's welcoming and respectful of differences. So the other piece that we've engaged in quite a bit of dialogue around is, why is it important to have a diverse and inclusive workforce? And where we've landed at this point, and it's ever evolving because of, we have a project team with participation throughout the organization, but where we've currently landed is that, diversity, and not just the visible diversity, with that comes broader perspectives, the opportunity to get additional information and experiences, different thought processes, different ideas, and all of these things together enable us as an organization to, have more information than we would otherwise and make better decisions as an organization. And in terms of inclusion, being respected, having your differences sort of welcomed and appreciated, contributes to employees having a sense of belonging, contributes to employees feeling more engaged, both with the work they're doing and with those that they work with. And another area of primary focus for our organization. We have an employee population that works throughout the region at a variety of different sites and locations, many of which are in the field. And so we're looking for ways to ensure that we're inclusive across our employee groups and work groups. And so sometimes, and in rolling out sort of this work that we're wanting to do and gain participation from, employees throughout our organization, we've needed to make some adjustments in terms of how we're communicating, for instance, and really sort of thinking through what needs to happen to get the collaboration, to get the engagement that we need to ensure this work is really meaningful. The other thing that we've also established and sort of, have some agreement on at a high level currently are some guiding principles for this work. And they're, looking at them on the slide, sort of these 4 bullets, they're seemingly obvious, but sort of being clear on what's critical for this work to roll forward in a meaningful way is, we need strong leadership commitment, for instance. That goes without saying. We need individuals to have accountability, and it needs to be a shared responsibility. This isn't something that we can lead within human resources alone. We need sort of participation, engagement, and shared responsibility from employees throughout the organization. We also need dedicated support and resources, and ongoing communication and engagement is also sort of a guiding principle and critical as we move forward.
Thanks, Maggie. So I'm going to take you through the next little bit. Oops, sorry. So the second stage in our journey, once we had received kind of approval to move forward on the proposal that we put forward, was to actually gather some information about our employee population. We needed to know what did diversity look like in our employee population, excuse me, and what were their thoughts around how inclusive the organization was. And so we wanted to gather that information for 2 reasons. One, to have that knowledge, but also so that we could establish a baseline of information. So as we moved through with doing this work, we would be able to look back and kind of compare and see, has the work that we've done kind of moved that needle in terms of our diversity and inclusivity. So we elected to partner with BC Stats to do the survey that Maggie mentioned earlier, the Employee Experience and Diversity Survey. And we partnered with them, chose to partner with them for 2 main reasons. First was around confidentiality and privacy. By partnering with BC Stats, they were able to administer the survey, gather the data, do the analysis, and then provide us with aggregate information. So the individual responses that our employees provided, that was protected in terms of their privacy and confidentiality. The other reason we opted to I'm just going to change the slide. I realized I didn't change it. The other reason that we opted to go with BC Stats was that we knew that they already had some statistical information that would allow us to then compare and see how were we doing in terms of our diversity compared to the region that we serve, as well as provincially, because we knew that they had that data. So as Maggie mentioned, in December of 2020, we finalized the survey with BC Stats, and they administered it for us. It was a voluntary survey, again, confidential aggregate data. And the survey was made up of 2 parts. There were 7 demographic questions that we asked, and there were 13 employee experience questions that we asked. In terms of response rates, organization-wide, we received a 78% response rate, which we were really happy to see. It's a high response rate given the type of survey that we were doing and the size of the organization that we are. Our employee population is made up of 3 groups. The first, that shows on the screen there, the GEU, that's one of our unionized groups. It's more of our outside, so people working in the field, people working in plants, And so the response rate there was 64%. That's where our operators' positions lie in that GEU group. 85% of our Teamsters employees responded to the survey. They are another unionized group, more not exclusively, but mostly are inside workers, office and work to that nature. And then the final group is the exempt or excluded, so the non-unionized group and management staff, which had an 88% response rate. And so the experience portion, employee experience portion of the survey, as I noted, there were 13 questions or statements that were put to the employees in the survey. And really that was so that we could gather a sense of what their thoughts were around inclusion. So what was their thoughts around sense of belonging in the organization? What did they think about Metro Vancouver's value on diversity? What was their personal and professional support? How did they feel about that? What was their overall thoughts around the work environment and the communications and the connections at Metro Vancouver? The questions, there was 13 statements in the survey, and respondents were asked to rate them from a scale of 1 to 5, strongly disagree to agree, and they could also put don't know or not applicable. And so of the aggregate data that we received from BC Stats around the employee experience questions or statements, the 6 that you see on the screen are our highest rated average scores. So we were really happy to see that that there was high scores in things like having positive working relationships with coworkers, being able to have open conversations with supervisors, and feeling that the work unit really values diversity in people and backgrounds, amongst some other statements there. In terms of the statements that had lower scores, and so, identified as real opportunities to look at, more immediately in terms of what we could do, there were a number, you can see them here on the screen, such things as essential information flowing from executive down to staff. The input that I provide into my decisions that affect my work are valued. So those were a couple of the statements that we didn't score quite as high on. The second part of the survey was the demographic portion of the survey, and we asked 7 demographic questions intended to have a better understanding of our employee population. So those questions were around gender identity, LGBTQ2S+ community membership, whether you were an Indigenous person, an immigrant, a visible minority, a person with a disability, and then we also asked a question around population groups. So some of the questions had a simple yes, no, prefer not to answer response option. Some of the questions, such as persons with disabilities, had more options that people could provide responses to. And we had some kind of early initial learnings when we rolled out the survey in terms of the way that we asked the questions. So we did partner with BC Stats and took guidance from BC Stats in terms of what we should, what we wanted to ask and how we wanted to ask it so that we could have that apples to apples comparator. But one lesson we learned in particular, for example, is around the gender identity question. The options available were male, female, other, and we learned fairly quickly from our employees, as well as just continuing education that we've been taking ourselves, that next time around we would certainly open that up to have some additional response options. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of the data. We did receive a lot from BC Stats. We're not going to go through all of it today. But before I do that, just want to draw your attention to a couple pieces of information. In order to have that comparator of apples to apples, we first had to look at all of the job codes, the job types that we have in the organization, and kind of plot them to the job codes that BC Stats uses, which is the National Occupation Classification, the NOC codes. So that was the first step. When you look at the slide there with the graph on it, you can see there's 3 demographics. So there's women, LGBTQ2S+, and persons with disabilities across the bottom. If you just look at the women portion, you can see there's 4 bar graphs. The dark blue is the Metro Vancouver data that we received from BC Stats. The 2 middle columns are BC population and BC total workforce. And then the white column to the right, that's the available workforce. And that's what we used as a comparator. It's essentially all of the people in British Columbia that are employed in the same job types or job codes that we identified at Metro Vancouver. And so we thought this was a good comparator, but we do recognize it's not a perfect comparator. There could be systemic issues that are limiting the makeup of that available workforce. So we recognize that even where we compare favorably in terms of the available workforce, doesn't necessarily mean that our work is done for that demographic. There's still areas where we can look to see how we can improve. So in terms of this slide, you'll see that Metro Vancouver employs more women than the available workforce. On the right, you can see we employ less persons with disabilities than the available workforce. And in the middle, you probably noticed there's just one bar, the blue Metro Vancouver data bar. That's because BC Stats doesn't have information related to LGBTQ2S+. But we opted to gather that information anyway. As we mentioned off the top, it was important for us to have a better understanding of our employee demographic. And also we wanted to make sure that our survey wasn't excluding any particular demographic. And hopefully, perhaps in the future, BC Stats will also collect that information so we can, again, compare that demographic as well. So on this slide, we can see that we employ slightly less immigrants at Metro Vancouver than the available workforce, slightly more visible minorities, and less Indigenous persons. In terms of the three work groups, or employee groups that we mentioned earlier, we can see here that the GVRD EU, so that's that outside field plant operator kind of group, there's a much lower proportion of women employed at Metro Vancouver. In the middle is that Teamsters unionized group, so a much higher proportion of women there. And then a somewhat more evenly distributed proportion in the other two demographics, the LGBTQ2S+ and persons with disabilities. In terms of immigrants and visible minorities, we can see there's a relatively low proportion in the GVRD EU work group as well, and a bit of a higher proportion in terms of Indigenous peoples that are employed in that particular work group. And lastly, the seventh demographic is the population group. Again, we took guidance from BC Stats in terms of which population groups we would want to include in our survey. We did receive that aggregate data. BC Stats does have fairly strict rules around suppression, so there is some information that we just weren't able to receive because there weren't enough responses in a particular group, and so they wouldn't release it to us to ensure confidentiality of those respondents. So the information that we do have in terms of population groups, though, we found that we're relatively reflective of the available workforce in terms of Chinese, South Asian, and white population groups. And we're slightly higher in representation of the available workforce for Filipino, Latin American, and Southeast Asian. And I think Maggie's going to take us through the next few slides.
So just following along our journey and the key steps that we've taken as an organization, the next step that we took subsequent to the BC Stats survey was to establish a project group. So I'll walk you through that here briefly. In order to form the project group, we've mentioned this a few times now throughout the presentation, but it was important and really actually critical that we had diverse employee participation. So There was an extensive staff or employee engagement process. We used various communication channels. We sent posters to sites. We liaised with supervisors. We hosted lunch and learns. And we also held an expression of interest process open to all staff. And again, sort of to reach, our works yards and our plants and other work locations, we sent those to staff and made them available to be submitted sort of in writing, electronically, however people were able or wanted to submit their expression of interest, they were welcome to do so. So not having done this before, we really didn't know what to expect and whether we would receive very few or very many expressions of interest, but we were really, really pleased with the response and overall received 50 or a little over 50 expressions of interest from staff throughout the organization. And initially we thought that we may need to sort of do some targeted outreach to, further ensure that we've captured sort of, the voices of all of our different employees within our organization. And we needed to do just a limited amount of that to ensure that we had representation from all groups within the organization. So we also thought a lot about sort of how would this project group be formed? What would the governance structure be? And the image that you see on the slide here, you see three principal components. The executive sponsors, a steering committee, and a research team, with the research team being split into three subgroups, focusing on an individual area, so talent acquisition, talent development, and workplace experience. One critical piece to sort of how this governance structure is displayed visually are the feedback loops, and really the research teams and those communication channels up and the recommendations in terms of what we need to be doing as an organization are critical components. So it isn't a top-down hierarchy. In some cases, there will be some direction from the executive sponsors or steering committee to do research or to explore different areas. But in essence, those recommendations will be coming up from the research groups primarily. We also, not represented on this slide, and importantly, we have a metrics subcommittee made up of members from the steering committee as well as the research team. And the metrics committee will be responsible for a number of key items, including our work plan and tracking of our work plan, and also measuring and reporting on progress as we go. And we also foresee that the metrics subcommittee may come forward with additional recommendations for sort of data that we may want to pursue as an organization with BC Stats. There was a lot of foundational work that needed to occur in forming the project team. So if any of you have taken organization development courses, the forming, storming, norming, this piece and this foundational work was really, really critical and important. And admittedly, it took more time than we initially anticipated. But in terms of sort of major steps along the way and what it encompassed, we had a large sort of project launch meeting with members from all of from the entire project group. We established terms of reference for the steering committee as well as the research teams. There were roles and responsibilities in each of the groups that were assigned, so things like chairs and co-chairs and recorders and liaisons with the research teams and members of the metrics subcommittee. And we also implemented a consistent decision-making process across the project group. And so we have a consensus decision-making model in place that sort of governs how decisions and recommendations are brought forward by the group. I mentioned sort of, forming, norming, storming. There was a lot of collaboration involved that we promoted sort of in this stage of the work. And it did, mentioned also, it did take a bit longer than we anticipated. I would say it was a critical step, and sort of ensuring that this foundational work was accomplished in a meaningful way, in a collaborative way, was important. And it also put us all on the same page. And now we're sort of moving forward with the work. And so the next step that we embarked on in our journey was a strategic planning process. And this involved and will involve participants from the entire project team, but was primarily led by the steering committee. So we engaged a consultant to help facilitate this work, a neutral third party. Strategic planning work is something that we do facilitate from time to time by our own staff within the Human Resources Department. But there's a number of us within our department currently that play roles on the steering committee, as well as have responsibilities for this work. And so having that neutral third party to facilitate this work, we thought was really important. In terms of our strategic plan, we focused on developing a vision, a mission, and strategic priorities. And on this slide sort of are those primary steps that were involved in our process. So it considered where are we now, where do we want to be, how will we get there, who must do what, and how will we know how we're doing. Like many strategic planning processes, it was somewhat muddy and has taken a number of iterations to get where we are. But we do now have a draft, concise, powerful strategic plan that we will be moving forward with. So we'll provide you some pieces of that here shortly. So the vision involved, where do we want to be long term? And it's really the anchor for our strategic plan. There were some themes that evolved, but what's displayed here on the slide is our draft vision to date. It involves thinking forward that we will be a leader in diversity and inclusion, will celebrate and empower diversity, and foster sort of that work environment where individuals have a sense of belonging. In terms of the mission, of course, a mission involves considering how will we attain that vision. And so there were some key questions that we needed to ask relating to that. And again, it's in draft form, but on the next slide here is our draft mission to date. And some of the themes that emerged there were around being reflective of the region we serve, safe and inclusive work environment where we're going to mitigate bias and promote innovative and forward-thinking processes and policies into sort of those principal areas that we're focusing on currently.
Okay, so Maggie mentioned in both the vision and the mission, some of the words that were in those, the vision and the mission included diversity and inclusion. So we realized fairly quickly that we needed to come up with a common definition of diversity and inclusion, because there's a lot of different definitions out there. So we wanted to make sure we had some common language, so when we referred to these terms at Metro Vancouver, everyone knew what we were referring to. So again, we just have a working definition. We're still working to finalize these, but you can see that it talks about visible and invisible characteristics and values and beliefs. It gives some examples of what those might be that make us each unique, such as age, culture, education, ethnicity, for example. And then the bottom, the last sentence there talks about how these factors can intersect and compound, and then potentially create different experiences for people. Similarly, for inclusion, we have a working definition. It talks about having commitment or making a commitment to remove those barriers that may be there for certain groups, and cultivating that environment that's safe, that's respectful, that's fair and equitable, so that employees can feel comfortable coming to work, bringing their true selves, bringing their whole selves, and feeling like they have that sense of belonging at the workplace. So once we had worked on developing our vision, developing our mission, and the definitions, we needed to look at what were going to be our priorities. And so we came up as a project group with 4 strategic priorities, which you can see there on the screen. The first one being inclusive culture and environment. So the project group is going to continue, the work they're going to do is going to continue to foster that that culture of inclusion and that sense of belonging, and identify and remove barriers that may be in place for certain groups. We want to ensure that we have diverse partnerships and programs, so continuing to, as we're developing partnerships internally and externally, making sure that we're keeping diversity in mind, making sure that those programs and those partnerships are accessible to all. The third one is having transformative education and awareness. So ensuring that as a project group and as an organization, we're promoting education that will allow people to broaden their mindsets and create that space for those difficult yet important discussions to occur. And then the last one is transparent measuring and reporting. So we want to make sure that we're making decisions from a perspective of having some data, and that we're also able to look back and see where were we, where are we now, and again, have we been able to meet our goal of increasing diversity and inclusivity at Metro Vancouver. And so we've talked a lot about how we have we've made this concerted effort to have this diversity and inclusion work. We've developed the project group, we were communicating to the organization, but just want to mention that that's not something that's new to us at Metro Vancouver. It's not that we haven't been aware of diversity and inclusion. In fact, we have, and we've felt it's very important. It's been a strong value for quite some time. We're just making a concerted effort right now to have this definitive group doing the work, but there's been parallel streams of work all along that has incorporated diversity and inclusion into it. And so some of the examples we have to share with you today, we have an international engineers program, which we are really excited. We've just started the pilot project so that employees at Metro Vancouver who have the international credentials and training in engineering, but that need the Canadian work experience, have that opportunity. We have a number of employee-led initiatives. For example, we have a group led by a number of employees called OSTEM, and that's the Advocates for Women in Science, Technology, Trades, Engineering, and Math. The BCIT Operators Program, so BCIT, Metro Vancouver, and EOCP partnered to develop this Operators Program, which we're also really excited. The first cohort is going through now and will be completing in October. The Builders Code Pledge, so this is something in June of last year, our CAO signed the Builders Code Pledge, and so that is an initiative through the BC Construction Association to ensure an equitable environment for those in the construction industry. We have a mentorship program where we partner mentees and mentors internally. An internal communications plan. We've always had a very robust internal communications plan and program. But more recently, we've been really purposeful about celebrating different religious and cultural celebrations and events and days of importance. And unconscious bias training. So for the last number of years, we've had open sessions for employees that want to take it to have a better understanding about what is unconscious bias and what does that mean and what does it mean as I'm going through my work day. Yep, and so we've walked through our steps with you today, and so the last thing that we want to just share with you is next steps. We're going to be finalizing all the work that we've done, sharing it with the organization, and taking all the great ideas that we've had along the way and putting that into a work plan to actually action the items. And so that concludes our presentation for today. Before I turn it over, just want on behalf of Maggie and myself say thank you very much for joining us here today.
Am I on? Great. Excellent presentation, both of you. Thank you very much. If you don't mind hanging out on stage just for 2 seconds, in case we have any questions. I'm not seeing, sorry, there was one on the chat that I'll just scroll back to. Give me 1 minute. Yes. Absolutely great suggestion, Kalpana. One of the questions I have from Kalpana here is, will you be repeating your survey to check on the effectiveness of changes to increasing diversity, and if so, when? And I actually was going to ask that question as well.
Yeah, I would say yes, we will be. In terms of precisely when, the survey was initially went out to staff in December 2020. We won't be ready to survey. I think ideally we would probably do it on an annual basis. I don't think we'll be far enough along in terms of sort of actions coming from the project team to do it again in this December, so just in a couple of months' time. So it might be staggered sort of between the first and second time that we survey, sort of a bit more broadly 18 months to 2 years versus kind of the 12-month period. But I think it is something we'll want to do again. It's something that also we've learned a lot from in terms of, when we embark on surveying again, just in terms of formulating questions, really wanting to know that data that we want sort of at the outset. So yeah, it was an interesting process, but if anyone has detailed questions about that, Carolyn or I, we're happy to sort of take those offline.
Excellent. And I have one more. It's from Derek, and he is asking if your surveys turned up any reasoning to why the Indigenous population among your workforce would be so low.
So the survey didn't turn up any more information that would allow us to have an answer to that question. But the reason we were so excited to do the survey was to actually find out that data. Up until that point, we didn't really know what the demographic of our organization was. And so the project group that we've put together, we've got kind of a long list of items that we need to really look at, and some of them, ones that we'll be looking at sooner rather than later are the ones that really were evident from the survey. So unless there's anything more, yeah, thank you for that. Good question.
Excellent. Thank you both.